Learning is an incredibly crucial part of becoming a better person and for a career, isn't it? I've always been someone who's wanted to learn something new. And hey, that's even why I pounced at the opportunity to talk to Liam here today. And Liam is going to talk to us about how you instill this mentality of learning within your organization, especially given how all of us are working hybrid and nowadays. So, Liam, thank you for joining us here today. Why don't you tell all of us here who you are and what we're going to be doing today?
Great. Thank you so much, Kaushika. So yes, I'm Liam Abramson. I'm a founding partner of an organization called Starfish VILT. And the VILT part of the Starfish brand stands for Virtual Instructor-Led Training. So what we run are highly interactive, highly engaging virtual learning and development programs. I've been doing this type of work for over 25 years and have worked with organizations from oil, gas, and energy to the financial sector to manufacturing, retail, pharma, biopharma, medical devices, you name it, right across the board. Of course, we do a lot of in-person training as well, but we try and create blended learning solutions. And of course, for the last 2.5 years, have been running exclusively virtual sessions since so many people have been working remotely and in sort of a hybrid fashion.
Got it. Perfect. Just the person who you wanted to have this conversation with. All right, Liam. So, as we get started, one thing is learning should never be something that stagnates, or it should never be just what one or two people want to do. It needs to be imbibed with the culture of the organization, doesn't it? So,
Mm-hmm.
how does an organization look to make learning a part of their culture?
So that's a really good question. And learning, the research after research after research has shown that those organizations that succeed, and if you have the sort of top 20% and then the bottom 20% and the middle 60%, those that fit into the top 20% from for a range of metrics from retention to productivity to profitability, have shown over and over again that one of the contributory reasons to that is because they have a culture of learning. And what a culture of learning really looks like is that learning is seen as something that's really developmental and not remedial. So, somebody is being sent on a leadership development course or a course to do with providing feedback or how to delegate or something like that, that they see this as something, as a reward almost, as it's something that, wow, you are investing in my future development. Whereas the organizations that see learning as being remedial, that why do I need to go on this program? What have I done wrong? Those organizations usually do not have a culture of learning. So when learning is incorporated into the fabric of the organization, and the organizations that I've seen do extremely well are those organizations that still stress the importance of learning and development, even when the organization itself is maybe not doing that well due to market conditions or competitive impact or something like the pandemic, where people are not being maybe as productive as they can be, but they still stress the importance of, let's continue developing you, because we're not just developing you for your current role, but we're also developing you for your next role. And if that is the attitude of an organization, that's where we really have a successful organization.
Perfect. Love how you mentioned that it's not supposed to be remedial, because it took me back to my school days when remedials were basically additional classes you had to take up if we weren't performing as expected, or if our rank
Correct.
started to dip, we had to take these remedial classes. So I love how you mentioned that that is not how you look at learning as such.
Yeah, absolutely. So important.
And Liam, so interesting how you brought about when you started the conversation saying you've done offline trainings, you've done virtual trainings, and over the past 2 years, it has predominantly been virtual, given the condition.
Correct.
Now, given this, do you see that one has an as a higher impact than the other, or even if I were to rephrase that, is virtual not delivering as big as an impact as offline training?
So this is a complex question, because if you would have asked anybody this question 2.5 years ago, they would have said, no, virtual doesn't offer anything. It has to be in person. We're going to fly everybody across the country and put them in some hotel and run a 2 or 3 day training program. And that's where we're going to get our best benefit. Of course, when the pandemic happened and everyone went on lockdown and offices shut down, many organizations stopped learning and development altogether, but those more progressive ones continued pushing their learning and development. And of course, it all went virtual. There was an adjustment period where people didn't quite understand what virtual was. And then a lot of organizations just tried to replicate the in-person training in the virtual world, which means if you had an 8-hour in-person training course, they tried to make it an 8-hour virtual session, which just does not work. So there had to be a complete shift in methodology and a complete shift in how people thought about not only what virtual instructor-led training is, not only how to attend those programs, i.e. what is the technology available, but then also how to design those programs. And there is a fundamental design shift that needs to take place. So what we're seeing now is, because people are more welcoming of virtual, they're used to it now. Everyone's got MS Teams or Zoom or WebEx or all of these systems on their computer. Everybody knows how to use them. The technology is no longer a barrier to participation. People are now beginning to realize, wow, actually, I can sit on a virtual session for 2 hours as opposed to sitting in a half-day face-to-face program. I don't have to leave my desk. I don't have to travel. I don't have to stay in a hotel. I don't have to have the expense of doing all of that. And I can still get a fair amount of engagement and a fair amount of interactivity, and I can still learn something and can still make an impact. More importantly, what people are realizing is that if I work in a global organization, I can be on the same training program as somebody in India, somebody in China, somebody in Australia, somebody in the UK, somebody in the US. We can all be together. And so people are learning more about their own organizations rather than having regional training events where only those people from the region attend. So, to go back to your original question, is it better? Is it worse? Is it more productive? Is it less productive? I think the answer is yes and no, or to put it another way, no and yes. I mean, we have to make sure that we're doing the right sort of training in the virtual world. Now, virtual training is not right for every type of training. If you're doing some sort of hands-on product training, that's probably still better face-to-face. If you're doing some sort of long-term leadership development program, probably the way that it's going to land up going forward is much more of a blended solution, where you may come together at the beginning in a centralized location and then do 5 or 6 months virtually, and then at the end come together again in a centralized location. So you have the best of both worlds. One thing that we do need to remember, though, is VILT, virtual instructor-led training, is something that's very, very unique. It is not a webinar, nor is it e-learning, but it is highly interactive, highly engaging learning in the virtual space. So people are involved, they're talking, they're chatting, they're working in breakout rooms, they're doing presentations, they're working on projects and presenting back their ideas from their projects and so on. It is not a one-way flow of information like a webinar or a just-in-time, just-for-me type training such as e-learning. It is still a collaborative, collegiate process where groups of cohorts of participants and groups of participants get together, share knowledge, and work on problems.
8 hours of virtual training back to back. My God. But everything you're saying makes perfect sense. Because I was also this person who always believed that, hey, these interactions have to be in person. But now we've all learned to adapt to this, and there are so many benefits to this. I love that. And there's one more thing that you mentioned that you've been mentioning, Liam, in which you spoke about how a lot of businesses that are successful are ones that did not cut off learning despite the pandemic. Can we unpack that a little in the sense? Because naturally, some of our other speakers also brought this up, in which naturally L&D is one of the first things that gets budget cuts.
Yeah.
When that's the case, how can organizations look at learning still being a part of this entire thing?
So, and you're absolutely right. I mean, the first two budgets that get cut when crisis hits is your travel and entertainment budget, and then your learning and development budget. And I've seen in some of my clients, definitely their budgets have been cut, but they are still focused on developing their people, because when there's crisis, there's a there was an interesting book written by Michael Kaiser called The Art of the Turnaround, an excellent book written about nonprofit organizations. And he spoke about, and it was written in 2008, 2009 during the last recession. And he was talking in that book about the fact that when organizations hit crisis, our natural tendency is to contract, i.e. cut programs, cut departments, cut budgets, cut projects, and we contract. Whereas what we should do is very counterintuitive. We should actually try and expand in certain areas during times of crisis, to not only send a message to our internal stakeholders that you are still important and what we're doing is still important, but also send a message to our external stakeholders showing that we are still a viable organization and we still exist. Now, of course, budgets have to be cut because we've got to make sure the bottom line is healthy. But by spending time developing individuals, even during those low times in an organizational life cycle, prepares them for the high times in the cycle. If you're on a policy of, when things are good, let's spend money on training, well, there's not going to be time for all that training because things are good and we can't find enough bandwidth to be able to do everything that we're doing. And then if we cut that training when things are not that good, well, then we're not preparing people for the times where things are good. So it becomes a vicious cycle at the end of the day if you're really not thinking strategically about keeping a sort of constant level of learning and development throughout the organizational life cycle.
Got that. And you also mentioned, Liam, verbatim, you mentioned about developing our people. That was beautifully put. And with the world acting up in crazy ways, not just the pandemic, however, with also these huge inflations in the market that we're seeing, that we're witnessing right now, there's a lot of the great resignation, so to say, which is also going around. Now, how important is learning when it comes to, or rather offering learning as a part of their compensation when it comes to hiring or even retaining talent?
Mm-hmm. So I think it's hugely important because we talk about the great resignation. And I heard somebody the other day use a slightly different term. And the term that they use is that it's not really the great resignation, but it's the great renegotiation. And what does that mean? It means that people are taking the time right now to renegotiate their lives. I think what the pandemic has actually shown us all is that we no longer need to build our life around the workplace, but we now are to a certain extent empowered to build our life, to build the work around our life. So we are going in search of opportunities that allow me to live my life the way that I want to live my life, but I can renegotiate all those other things as far as the work is concerned. So what is this? How does this relate to learning and development? And it is a fundamental aspect of why people join and leave organizations. How much am I going to be developed? How much am I going to be coached? How much care are people in the organization and my manager and my manager's manager going to take in preparing me, for not only for my career aspirations, but also for my personal aspirations? How much do they really invest in me as a person? Or am I just a dispensable number that when things get tough, first in, first out, or last in, first out type thing? So learning and development is a huge draw to how people will renegotiate their lives. And if they will go from one organization to another organization based on a bunch of things, the commute and the type of work and the social aspect of the work and all of those Maslow and Hertzberg factors of motivation. But one of the things that will really draw people to an organization is how much are you prepared to invest in me as a person? And that is where this constant level of learning development has to come in.
Perfect, perfect. Now, this actually reminds me of our conversation with Anisa as well, who is one of our other speakers. And she also rephrased it as the great reappraisal.
Yes,
We're all just rethinking what is
rethinking.
actually happening and what is in our power and what we really want. So love that. All
Yeah.
great, great points so far, Liam. And as we were discussing about the whole idea of budget cuts or how we retain or attract talent, one really important thing is how do you measure learning and development in the sense because that is something that is always going to get us
Mm-hmm.
approval from the management. If I say, hey, I had this much increase in retention of employees, or I had these many people moving up and getting promoted after I introduced this learning program, is there something like that that we can talk to or track?
So the ROI of learning development is notoriously difficult to calculate. And yeah, there are a bunch of models out there that we can plug in and so on. The fact is, if somebody joins a leadership development program and 5 years later is promoted to become CEO of the company, is there a direct causal or direct correlation between them becoming CEO and them having attended that leadership development program? And the simple answer is no. They may have become CEO despite going on this program, or maybe the program did help them and benefit them in a certain way. So how do we measure the ROI of learning development? It's multifaceted. So yes, so there's a motivation aspect. So most organizations will run an employee engagement survey. And if they feel that they're engaged in their work, and the reason why they're engaged in their work is because you're giving me the right tools and the right skills to do my work, then that may be attributable to learning and development. Can we now, of course, in technical training, there can be a direct correlation between how well somebody does something based on the program that they attended, or a series of programs that they attended that taught them how to do that particular task. But in soft skills training, such as leadership development, it's notoriously difficult to calculate, and it has to be taken as only one part of the whole process, because learning and development is not just going on a training course, but it's also coaching and mentoring, and how people are given receive feedback, and how you create a culture of network and a culture of sharing within the organization. And so these are some of the things that we really have to take into account throughout the process of when we're trying to ascertain, has the learning been successful or not?
All right, perfect. So we spoke about ROI, Liam, and all that makes perfect sense. Now, how about we shift gears and look at a tactical approach and say, hey, this is how you could implement an L&D program, or this is how you can approach an L&D program for your employees.
So you're talking from an organizational perspective, how they can plan an L&D strategy. And so, first and foremost, there has to be a needs analysis. Just doing training for the sake of training is a waste of everybody's time, and a waste of resources, and a waste of money. So there has to be a needs analysis, and a lot of the organizations that I work actually go out and survey people and say, look, you're in sales, or you're in finance, or you're in marketing, or you're a people leader. Maybe you're a new people leader. Maybe you're making one of those transitions from being a leader of others to a leader of leaders. What skills do you need? And once they come back and say, well, I need skills in delegation, I need skills in feedback, I need skills in conflict management, I need skills in change management, then the L&D department or the L&D consultant can go out and plan a series of programs that's going to help fit those needs. So the number one question you always have to ask yourself if you're planning any form of L&D strategy is, what's the need? More importantly, what problem am I trying to solve? We all have solutions. I've got a bag full of solutions to problems that you maybe don't even have. That's not a reason for you to take advantage of the solutions. We've got to define the problem first before we put in place the solution. And the best way to get anybody invested in any form of L&D program is to involve them in the process. So survey your audience, go through to your employee base, ask them what they need. Ask them what's missing, ask them where they need help, and then it's the responsibility of the L&D team to build that help and put it into place.
Gotcha. And I love how you said, don't just run it for the heck of it, because that a lot of time this happens, doesn't it? L&D is tasked with running, say, 10 programs a quarter for 20 among 20 teams. And it's just like a number you're running after. Hey, I need to get in these many hours of learning. I need to have these many people attend. And that shouldn't be how you track this or look at this, right?
Correct.
And Liam, so you mentioned a bunch of really interesting things in which we're approaching the whole idea of L&D based on a need. Now, we all of us live in a remote world, and clearly it's here to stay. So it's going to be hybrid, or even if it's going to be office, that flexibility is always something that is going to be imbibed as part of any organization. When that's the case, how should companies look at learning? Because let's say it's an employee in the office, the way how they get their coaching and learning is going to be dramatically different from someone who's working remote. So how do you structure programs for the hybrid world?
So that's a big question, and that's a question that I'm not sure anybody has the absolute answer to just yet, because we've never really had to do it in such massive quantities. You know, there's always been some occasionally a remote person who's joined a program, and you've got 10 participants sitting in a classroom and 2 people who are remote because for whatever reason, and generally what happens is that those 2 people get forgotten. And somewhere towards the end of the program, you hear some sort of crackle from the speaker in the ceiling, and you go, "Oh my God, yes, you're still here. I forgot about you." So that was the traditional way that people joined remote learning. Now, now people are more aware of what sort of working in a hybrid team may look like and what virtual learning actually is. So the answer to your question is that we have to think of it differently. We constantly, throughout the last 2.5 years, we've been hearing the phrase, I so look forward to going back to normal. And it's that back to normal piece that really bugs me, because I don't think we should be going back to normal, because if we go back to normal, it means that we haven't learned anything from the last 2.5 years. We have to take something away from the last 2.5 years, which creates a new normal. That's why I like to use the rather sort of tricksy term forward to normal, because we are going to create a new normality, but it should not look like it was 2.5 years ago. So when it comes to learning and development, what specifically does that look like? So definitely there's going to be more blended programs. So virtual is going to be a part of every single program, whereas previously it was usually an add-on because there was something that had to be done and people just couldn't travel, or it was very rare to have that virtual part as part of that face-to-face program. Now, I think it's probably going to be a 50-50 split, if not more of a 60-40 split, 60 in favor of virtual and 40 in favor of ILT, in-person learning. But we've also realized that there's a lot of good technology out there, and we can incorporate that technology to make that person sitting in the speaker on the ceiling not feel that they're being marginalized, but they're front and center and part of the training program. So just even simply using Zoom and having that projected and everybody's faces on the screen while other people are sitting around a table, that's already a step in the right direction, which we never really did 2.5 years ago. But there is a lot more type of technology that we can use to, instead of having people stand around a flip chart, face to face, and then what do the virtual people do because they can't interact with that flip chart? Well, we can use something like Poll Everywhere or Mentimeter, where it doesn't matter if you're virtual or not, you're sitting on your phone, you're sitting on your laptop, and you can all connect on the same virtual flip chart. So by incorporating technology and using the technology in the way it's being designed, that's going to make people feel, whether you in person or remote, you're still part of the same learning experience.
Yeah, the technology piece which you brought up was really interesting because that's something that is caught up to this world that we live in. Like in new innovations and inventions are being sprung up everywhere
All the time.
in this virtual domain, and it's really nice how people are focusing on the L&D aspect as well when it comes to that. And Liam, also on that note, so you mentioned about, so in the offline world when it came to training, we'd have our L&D people, they'd march us into a room, we'd make sure the instructor was there. And that was the adoption, so to say, in which
Yeah.
confined to this atmosphere, and hey, something's gonna get in no matter what. However, when it comes to virtual, there has to be that innate enthusiasm or that want to learn. Otherwise, you're sending this link requesting folks to join, and they might not necessarily do that. So, how
Mhm.
does adoption look from the other side of the room, from the employee side of the room, when it comes to remote learning?
So again, we got to differentiate between a virtual instructor-led training, a VILT, and say some form of informational webinar. The way that we increase engagement is, first and foremost, it becomes a program. So we don't just run at Starfish VILT, we don't just run a Zoom call and call that training. There's a whole bunch of things that happen before, during, and after, which increases that engagement. So first and foremost, we create a nice little 15-minute video that's sent out to everybody before the program, telling them what the program is going to be about. We have what we call an interactive flip book that they get a link to, which they can page through, and they can read some articles and watch some videos and find out what the objectives of the program are, and also register for anything that's going to happen. If there's some coaching going on, they can register for that. During the program itself, we restrict the numbers to a maximum of 25, because if you've got 300 people on a webinar, of course, 295 of them are going to be doing email, and maybe 5 of them will be, paying attention to what's happening on the screen. So as a result, we've got to make sure that, and that's fine. Webinars are great because it's a flow of information. But if you're going to call it training, it has to be something that's interactive. So by sending out the video, by getting them involved in the flipbook, by giving them access to an LMS where they can interact before the program even starts, introduce themselves, talk to the other participants, you're already creating a cohort and you're creating a community of practice. Once they're actually on the virtual session, it's about getting people active almost immediately. And at Starfish VILT, we have what's known as the 5-minute rule. And what the 5-minute rule says is, don't let any 5 minutes go by where somebody isn't doing something. So either typing something into their keyboard, or getting involved in a breakout session, or talking into their microphone, or commenting on a whiteboard, or whatever it might be. Every 5 minutes, they doing something. And so as a result, that maintains that engagement. It's notoriously difficult. Even in face-to-face programs, you'll have people sitting on their phones and sending a text message and sending an email. The beauty of a face-to-face program is that the facilitator has, the power of guilt. You can just walk up to this person and stare at them, and eventually they'll put their phone down. Now, you can't do that on a virtual session. So we have to design it in a way that reduces that temptation to want to do email or pick up your phone, because there's so much stuff going on in the room that people are engaged and they want to be in part of it. But it doesn't end there, because following the session, we then have to have some form of follow-up, some form of way, some method to embed the learning. So we use a lot of micro-learning applications that help people continue the learning following the session. There's usually some sort of application assignment, which they then have to upload onto a centralized LMS where the facilitator then comments on it. And so the learning continues. And if you're running, say, a leadership development program where there's 4 or 5 or 6 modules, even though the module is only 2 hours long and maybe they only happen once a month, because of all the pre-stuff and the post-stuff, people feel involved throughout the whole process, which then maintains people's engagement and keeps them coming back for more.
Gotcha. Makes perfect sense. And I love how you spoke about that power of guilt, because you just have to go stare and yeah. And loving everything you're saying, Liam. We touched on a bunch of various aspects, but hey, I want to know from you. Is there anything that we did not cover when it comes to learning and development in this new world that we live in? Or is there like a TLDR summary that you would like to share with everyone who's listening to us now?
So I think we've covered a lot. I think we just need to realize that we've got to incorporate technology into how we learn. But more importantly, no matter how good the technology is, if the design of the program is deficient, then the learning is going to be deficient. So we can't just throw things online and have all the whistles and all the stuff, the bells and whistles and all the fancy technology, if the design itself is not great. And ultimately, why do people come on any form of training course? And the reason why people come on the training course is to discover something that maybe they didn't know before. And when we do our learning, when we design our learning programs, a 2-hour program, when we think about even showing a PowerPoint deck, a 2-hour program will have maybe 10 slides. And that includes your introduction slide, it includes your goodbye slide, it includes your objective slide, it includes your rule of the road slide. So that's 4 out of your 10 slides right there. So we've only got like 6 slides of content. And you think, well, that's not a lot of content for 2 hours. However, our philosophy is learning comes from discussion. It doesn't come from death by PowerPoint. It doesn't come from showing model after model after model. It comes from introducing a concept and then getting everybody on the program to talk about that concept and get them to debate and argue and interact. And that is where the learning happens. The learning happens when people are talking to each other, not when they're listening to a facilitator. So as a result, I think if the people watching this webinar can take one thing away, it's about design the learning in a way that gets people involved and gets them interactive. It's not about what's on the slide that is important. It's about how people talk about the knowledge, how they share their best practices, and ultimately how they discover something that maybe they didn't know before.
Love that. Love that. Thank you, Liam. So many golden nuggets in there. And I'm sure all of us here have a bunch of questions that they want to ask you. Where can we find you after this conversation, Liam?
Feel free. Anybody can email me at labramson@starfishvilt.com, or feel free to go to the website, which is also starfishvilt.com. I'd be delighted to answer any questions and correspond with people, and never ever an intrusion to shoot an email to me.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Liam. And hey, thank you so much for joining us. I will see all of you in the other sessions.